Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this discussion sponsored by the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. My name is Jacob Downey, and I'm here today with award-winning journalist and best-selling author Ken Auletta. Auletta launched the Annals of Communications column for The New Yorker in 1992. He is the author of 12 books, including 5 national bestsellers. He was among the first to popularize the so-called information superhighway with his 1993 profile of Barry Diller's Search for Something New, and was ranked by the Columbia Journalism Review as America's premier media critic. CJR said that no other reporter has covered the new communications revolution as thoroughly as Auletta. New York Magazine described him as the media Boswell. He's here with us this afternoon to share about his incredible career and the future of the industry. Ken, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So we do have a lot to cover, not a lot of time to do it. But before we get into your incredible career as a journalist, we have a very important question. In our research, we read that your father discovered Sandy Koufax. Is that true? And can you shed a little bit of light onto how that came
Sure.
to be?
My dad was Pat Auletta was he started the Brooklyn Borough Sports League,
Hmm.
and he was president of it. He didn't take any money for it, but he created he basically promoted sandlot baseball in Brooklyn.
Hmm.
And Buzzy Bavesi, who was then the head scout for the Brooklyn Dodgers, would call my father and say, "Pat, who should I be looking at? What players, future players, should I be looking at for the Dodgers?" And he called my father and he suggested someone to my father. My father said, "No, you're looking at the wrong guy. You should look at this kid, Sandy Koufax." And in the biography, which Sandy Koufax fact checked, he didn't do an interview, but he cooperated with, he tells the story. The story is told in that biography by a woman um, who was a Washington Post writer. And he tells the story that basically Pat Auletta was the person who put the Dodgers onto me. And so it's one of
That's
the
awesome.
moments because Sandy Koufax is a hero of mine and of my brother, who actually has become a friend of Sandy Koufax. I'm not, but my brother is.
Aw, that's fantastic. I'm sure if he met you, he'd like you more.
I met him
Um,
once, and
you
actually, he
did?
told me the story about my father the one time I met him. But I was just awestruck by the guy. He's this great hero.
That's fantastic. So, staying kind of on the topic of Ken before journalism, before you began your career, you taught with the Peace Corps, and then you worked in politics, including on Senator Robert F. Kennedy's 1968 campaign for the presidency. How would you say that these experiences have impacted you?
Well, I got a graduate degree in political science, and that's where I taught Peace Corps trainees. And I thought I wanted to be working in government, politics, maybe the State Department, whatever, not run for office, but to work in it. And I spent a fair amount of time. I worked. My first job out of graduate school was with. I got a master's degree. I was in a PhD program, but I got bored with that. My first job was with a guy named Howard Samuels, who was running for governor of New York in '66 the first time, and I loved him. He's a wonderful man, and he invented baggies and the plastic clothesline. He was an engineer, and became very wealthy. Decided he wanted to reform politics. In '60, he lost that campaign. I then in '67 actually worked in a Robert Kennedy project. I was the only employee at the time. Robert Kennedy was committed to reforming the Democratic Party and bringing younger people in. And I was the executive director of that effort in Brooklyn. And that's where I first met him. I mean, I was a little pisher. I mean, it was not someone who was an intimate of Robert Kennedy. But when he ran then the following year for president, I quit my job and went to work for him, and was there waiting for him to come to New York that June day when he was murdered in California. Because the New York primary was next for him, and so that was the experience. And I then continued in New York. I waylaid a bit and became the editor of a paper called the Manhattan Tribune after Bobby's death, and then went quit that job when we decided that the owner of the paper was doing something corrupt, wanted to make it nice to the Nixon administration, and so I then went back to work for Howard Samuels, who ran for governor. I was his campaign manager in 1970, and in my help, he lost that race. And then um, he was appointed by, he was the first Democrat to endorse John Lindsay for reelection as, you know, for mayor in actually in 1969. And when Lindsay won that race, he asked whether Samuels, who was an engineer and a businessman, would start and oversee the first off-track betting corporation in the United States. And Samuels agreed for $1 a year to do that, and he hired me as the first executive director. So I had a big management job, um, and I did that. And then he ran for governor again in '74, and again I was his campaign manager, and again with my help he lost that race. So at that point, I said, I want to go back to journalism. I had written both in college and in graduate school for the student newspaper, and then did that effort with the Manhattan Tribune after Bobby's death in '68. And so I became a freelancer and then was hired by the Village Voice, New York Magazine, and ultimately the New Yorker. Also wrote a column for the Daily News and started writing books.
That's fantastic. From one political science major to another, it sounds like you really lived the dream, it seems.
Well,
So,
but the dream, you don't know what the dream is. I mean,
mm,
if you would have said to me one day that I'd be writing about, I wouldn't be in politics and government, I would be journalism, and I wouldn't be writing about politics, which is my training. I'd be
mhm.
writing about the media. I would have said, no way, I would never have predicted that. So life is full of wonderful surprises.
Yeah, of course. Are there any ways that you can think of that your background in writing about politics and working within politics influenced your trajectory as a media critic and journalist?
Yeah, one of the things you see in politics more clearly than you see in journalism is how complicated things
Mhm.
often are, and how motives are often much more complicated than we simply describe them in journalism in 5 or 700 word pieces. And so that helped me as a journalist, understanding complexity.
Mhm.
It also helped me understand the importance of listening and not talking too much and not opining too much, but listening to people. And actually, one of the things you find is that when you are an eager listener, people are more willing to talk and open up, and that becomes a very valuable thing for a journalist to have.
That's fantastic.
When I start off doing these long profiles on New Yorker, and I asked, Ted Turner, tell me about your childhood and tell me about your father, your relationship with him, and your mother and your relationship. And ultimately often yields very surprising information. In Ted Turner's case, he told me about the time that his father didn't trust him and didn't believe he should run his father's company one day, which was an outdoor billboard company. And he described a breakfast where he and his father and mother sat at the breakfast table. And then his father grumpily went upstairs and they heard a shot, a pistol shot. He ran upstairs and his father put a pistol in his mouth and left a note on the credenza to his best friend saying, Mike, I'm making up the name. I don't remember the name now, but I had it then in the piece in the New Yorker. He said, Mike, I want you to sell my company because Ted is not capable of running it. And when I'm walking on the street with Ted Turner and he's on the cover of magazines and he holds up a magazine to the sky and he says, Dad, look at this. Is this enough for you? I mean, it was very revealing about how what happened with his father was a great motivator in Ted Turner's amazing life.
Yeah. I wow. Very early in your career, you wrote a New Yorker profile about Mayor Ed Koch and an expose of lawyer Roy Cohn in Esquire. How did you approach reporting on these controversial and larger than life figures?
Well, with Cohn was actually the worst human being I've ever interviewed. Um,
Wow.
no one's even close. I mean, Harvey Weinstein was pretty bad, but Roy Cohn was in a class by himself.
In what way?
He lied. He proudly lied. He
Mm,
he attacked people savagely. he was indiscriminate in giving information. The first time, at first he wouldn't cooperate. So I called his law partner, who I knew, Stanley Friedman, and I said, Stanley, does Roy Cohn just want me to interview his enemies? Why is he not talking to me? It's kind of crazy. 5 minutes later, Roy Cohn called, and we began a series of many, many interviews. And the first interview was at the 21 Club, where he had a prime table, and he sitting there next to me, and I'm a stranger to him, with a notepad and a pen. And he looks around the room and he sees some of his various clients, women that he helped in divorce cases. And he starts gossiping to me about their private lives. And I'm just appalled that this guy is going under the covers of these women clients of his to a reporter. I didn't write any of it, but it was just extraordinary. But it just told you about his value system.
And so how do you approach writing about someone like that?
You spend a lot of time listening to him. You talk to people, his friends, including Donald Trump, who was considered Roy Cohn his mentor. And Roy Cohn would tell Donald Trump, and I wrote this in the piece. He says, never apologize, always go on offense, never on defense, and hyperbole, which we would call lie, but he called it hyperbole, is okay. In other words, claim claim things are true even though they're not. And if you look at Donald Trump's presidency, many of those precepts he follows. And at one point in his first term as president, he announced, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" He wanted someone to defend him the way Cohn would, savagely. And but you listen and you try and convey whatever complexity there might be. But in Cohn's case, the piece was called The Legal It was on the cover of Esquire magazine. It was called The Legal Execution. And I thought Roy Cohn would hate it. I mean, I would have hated it. If someone wrote that about me, I'd stay in bed. I wouldn't get out of bed. And Roy Cohn calls me up and he says, Ken, how do I buy 500 copies? For him, the legal execution was a calling card for his law practice. People would want to hire someone to kill their law partner or a legal partner or a business partner or a spouse. And he thought it'd be good for business. And he didn't care how he looked, or he
Gee,
cared that he looked like a killer.
wow. So actually, while we're on the topic, question from the audience. Why do you think that Roy Cohen trusted you so quickly?
Well, I'm a good listener, um,
As
and
stated.
and I don't, I'm asking questions, and if you're asking, you start off interviews talking about family, father, mother, schools you went to, friends you grew up with, what did you want to do? Those are fairly soft human questions
Hmm.
that are very valuable questions to ask. But I don't start off by asking, Roy Cohn, why do you lie about you? You start off asking those questions and you gain the confidence. You're not, it's not a trick on your part. You really, it's valuable information for you. And, but nevertheless, people then open up and Roy Cohn opened up.
Wow. Um, in 1992, you began writing the Annals of Communication column for The New Yorker. What kind of inspired you to move into kind of being a media critic?
I had written between 1985 and 1991. I spent 6 years reporting a book and writing a book called Three Blind Mice, How the TV Networks Lost Their Way.
Hmm.
And it was really a book about the media and about disruption, how broadcast television, which at one point in the 80s, 90% of Americans watched at night just three channels, NBC, ABC, and CBS. Well, now only 10% of people watch those three channels at night. And broadcast television was being disrupted, and that's what I wrote about. And I've written subsequent books about disruption, including a book called Google, The End of the World as We Know, which is how the digital world disrupted the world of cable and the world of broadcasting and the world of newspapers. In any case, so I do that, and Tina Brown, who was just appointed the editor of the New Yorker, I had written pieces for the New Yorker before, including you mentioned the Ed Koch profile, and Tina Brown called me up in '92 and said, "Would you come and write about annals of entertainment for the New Yorker?" And I said, "No, because I want to do a biography." I was thinking of a biography of Bob Kennedy, actually. And I said, "But you're thinking of it too narrowly, Tina. I think it's really annals of communication because the digital companies were getting into Hollywood and cable was in book publishing. Everything was kind of being smashed together. Into, it wasn't just about entertainment. It was about information and entertainment and the internet, et cetera, et cetera." And but then as I thought about it, the more I thought about it, I said, "Well, this might be kind of interesting." And that's what I did. So Annals of Communication grew out of the book I wrote, Three Blind Mice,
Mhm.
and and I did that very happily for a long period of time.
So you were criticizing media as a way of engaging with kind of the broader kind of subjects and moving pieces of the world around us?
Yeah, so I mean, I would do a profile of the editor or publisher of the New York Times. I did several of those.
Mhm.
But I would write about Viacom. I'd write about Microsoft and Bill Gates. I write about Google. Um, I wrote about, directors. So I basically saw my charge as broad and not confined to just say media.
That's awesome. So two other people you profiled were Ted Turner and Rupert Murdoch. What did you learn about these two figures, and who do you think was more difficult to cover?
Well, they hated each other. Murdoch had designs on buying CNN from Ted Turner, and Ted Turner considered Murdoch Hitler, and
Hmm.
would no more have sold him that. Um, Turner was a delight to spend time with. A strange character. I mean, he just, um, but quite a lot of fun. Murdoch, I spent more time with him then than he'd ever spent with a journalist. At first, he had resisted my entreaties to talk to him, and eventually agreed. And we wound up. I spent 10 days as a fly on the wall in his Los Angeles office. We had dinner, interviews about 5 nights, 5 of those nights, just doing interviews. Um, he could be a very charming man. He could be he's obviously a very bold, interesting businessman who's
Mhm.
done a lot of interesting things. But I was very tough on him, particularly for his journalism. And when the piece came out, it was called "The Pirate," and you can imagine how he might have reacted to that, and he did. And he's never granted me an interview since then. Um, that was 1995, so it's a long time ago. He It's a very interesting thing that happens when someone opens up to you and you spend an enormous amount of time with them, be it Murdoch or Ted Turner, whoever, or Bill Gates. I had a similar experience with Bill Gates. They, they and you write a piece that they don't like or they find too harsh on them, they feel betrayed. You
Mm.
didn't betray them. I didn't take something off the record and put it on the record. I didn't do anything like that. But they feel I thought you liked me. In a sense, is what they think. Even though you didn't give them advice, you didn't tell them you liked them. But it's a very natural human response, and that's part of the complexity that I think we all should pay a little more attention to. People are complicated. Rupert Murdoch, as harsh as I was on him and his journal, he's still a human being, and he still
Mhm.
has human emotions as as Bill Gates, who I spent a fair amount of time writing about when I wrote a book called World War 3.0, Microsoft and Its Enemies. He was very unhappy with me and again hasn't talked to me since. But that happens. So you just, I'm not in the business of doing popularity contests. So
Mm.
sometimes you alienate people, and because your job, your your shareholders are your readers as a journalist. They're not Bill Gates or Rupert Murdoch, and so you're writing for them, not for the principles you're profiling.
Mm. I'm curious, on kind of like on the flip side of that dynamic, was there anyone you interviewed where writing about them was difficult because of the amount of time you spent with them?
Well, one of the things that you asked me before about the relationship between having worked in politics and having worked in journalism. One of the things I've discovered um, is that journalism, in some ways, is more ruthless than politics. Because you, you're right. You're searching for the truth, and the truth, which may not be true, but you may believe it's true, and what you come to, um, may be harsh on the people you write about. In politics, there are things like loyalty. Someone supports your candidate for office, you don't, attack them the next year. There's a certain relationship you have, loyalty,
Mhm.
and you don't have that loyalty in journalism, in that, and you shouldn't, because your job is to try and approximate the truth as best you can. And so it's just inevitable that you're going to hurt people, and sometimes it's painful to you. I, Murdoch wasn't painful for me. It was a little more painful, um, and but you move on. I mean, you don't whimper, and you don't say I'm sorry. I mean, I have a job to do. He has a job to do, and I mean, has to fire people over the years, and I have to, as a journalist, have to sometimes upset people.
Mhm. In the aftermath of these interviews, or years in the aftermath of these interviews, CNN and Fox News grew to be some of the biggest news organizations on the planet. What do you think Turner and Murdoch's legacies will be, and where do you think the networks will go from here?
Well, then, the legacy, Turner's legacy. I mean, he decided ultimately in 1995 to sell CNN and Turner Broadcasting to Time Warner.
Hmm.
He was not happy years later about that sale, but he felt he needed a larger company to protect his smaller company.
Hmm.
He's not happy. I don't think Ted Turner is in great physical shape today,
Hmm.
but he has a great legacy. I mean, he started one of the great news organizations and changed news. I mean, you could 24 hours a day you can get news. You didn't have to wait till six or 6:30 at night for the network news to come on. 24 hours a day, CNN was on. So he's left a lasting legacy. Uh, Rupert Murdoch um, had, obviously has a legacy. I mean, we've never had in the history of this world, you've never had a media mogul
Hmm.
who's powerful on multiple continents and in multiple industries the way Rupert Murdoch has been. Hearst, Beaverbrook in England, um, um, all these people who were usually they were in one industry, print, and one country. Rupert Murdoch is in Australia, dominant, England, dominant, America, dominant. And not only that, unlike most of the other media moguls in history, he has used his power to advance his company. And he got approval from Margaret Thatcher to buy the Times of London and the Sunday Times, two estimable newspapers. He got an Export Import Bank loan of 7.5% interest for an airline he then owned in Australia from the Carter administration after he endorsed Jimmy Carter against Ted Kennedy in 1980. From Ronald Reagan, he got permission to call himself an American citizen and ultimately to buy the Fox network. Um, so he's been very successful uh, in, in, in gaining power and using that power, and the power to advance his political views. I mean, Donald Trump probably would not be president without Fox News and Murdoch's support, even though Murdoch privately was very critical of Trump and didn't think he was worthy of being president. But he did think he was worthy of being a friend of his in the White House. And he's been a supporter. And Trump once said, to his assistant, his secretary, don't ever put Rupert Murdoch on hold. If he calls, put him right through. So he's had a lasting impact.
As a journalist who has covered both of these people and like kind of experienced journalism before them, during them, and now kind of moving into the the period of after these two prolific figures, which do you think has had a greater impact on like the work we do as journalists?
Oh, it's hard to deny that Rupert Murdoch would
Mhm.
have had more influence. You look at you look at first, just start with Fox News, and even before that, start with something put on the Fox network, A Current Affair, which was the first tabloid TV show. He would tell people it's like he started in Australia. It was like 60 Minutes, but it wasn't. It was all about crime and sex and scandal, and
Mhm.
and from that grew out a lot of tabloid news shows that aped A Current Affair. If you look at Fox News and its impact, I mean, you just start with Donald Trump and the impact he's had, and Fox News promoting him in 2015 and 16. But before that, don't forget, he was a regular on Fox News, and the conspiracy theory he promoted that that Obama was not eligible to be president because he was not born in America was something he did constantly on Fox News, and promoted that. It was just a lie, uh, but nevertheless he promoted it, and he got a lot of attention, particularly from the right in Republican circles.
Kind of another question from the audience. How do you think that Murdoch's scandals will affect his legacy? The sexual harassment of Roger Ailes and other on-air people who were pushed out, the Dominion lawsuit that cost Fox News millions of dollars, and I think is why they're not officially allowed to call themselves a news um, program anymore, if I'm not mistaken. What do you think those all those controversies will
Well,
do?
they are allowed to. They do call themselves the news, and they talk about fair and balanced news on Fox.
Mhm,
Um, the Roger Ailes in 2016 was ousted because of sexual harassment.
mhm,
Bill O'Reilly was ousted in early 2017 for sexual harassment. He's come back and makes best-selling books and
mhm.
a big radio show. Uh, but with Murdoch, the things that will affect his legacy in a negative way are the hacking scandal of 2011 in England, where they his newspaper, the News of the World, hacked into the phone of phones of various celebrities, members of the royal family, politicians, and were caught doing that. And with Fox News, what happened in the Dominion case, Dominion claimed that they tried to talk to Fox News and say, you're putting on Rudy Giuliani and all these people who were saying that Trump really won the election and he lost only because of Dominion machines were corrupt and didn't tell you the true numbers that happened. Dominion said, we were only, uh, we were not, we called Ohio and Pennsylvania for Trump our machines, and our machines were only in 20% of the country. And no one has claimed, including the Justice Department under Trump, no one has claimed that there was fraud in that election. And yet you publish these stories on Fox News, and please don't do it. And they continued to do it, so Dominion sued them. And in the end, Fox was compelled to settle that lawsuit and pay $787 million to Dominion and to pay its lawyers. So Barry Diller was on a panel in England, and he was asked about it. He said, I'm a friend of Murdoch, but I believe, I'm paraphrasing, but I believe that Fox News and the Dominion lawsuit and the hacking scandal will poison my friend Rupert's legacy.
Mhm. So when you're working on these kind of like big, massive profiles, how much time would you say you generally spend with the subjects?
Well, I think the Murdoch profile probably was a 5 month project,
Mm,
20,000 words, which is a long piece. Um, I mentioned I spent 10 full days with Murdoch and 5 dinner interviews, but I'm interviewing scores of people, uh, both his supporters and his adversaries. over that period of time. And you're constantly going back to him and his people for fact checking. And, well, you said this, let me understand what this actually means. So you're deeply routed and engaged in that person's life for a very long period of time. You're reading a lot. Um, so his case, probably in Turner's case, was 4 or 5 months in both cases, and enormous amounts of time with them.
Do you feel like the big names that you've written about have helped other big names and important figures be willing to talk to you?
I, Probably. I mean, people
Yeah.
talk for various reasons. They talk, and one of the things I do is that I meet with the person and I say to them, I'm interested in understanding you, and I really am. And I'm assuming I'm not doing a one interview gotcha kind of interview where I've got 30 minutes and I've got to ask, tough questions. I'm assuming
Mhm.
that I'm going to spend multiple hours with the person. So I could start slowly and talk and get to know them and know the history um, in that. But people talk to you, A, if they believe you really are interested in A. B, the New Yorker with a fact-checking department, a very prestigious organization, also helps gain credibility for you as the reporter. The way you conduct yourself also helps. I mean, if I went in and treated the person I'm profiling like a dentist drilling their teeth, I mean, I'm not going to get a very cooperative interview, I think. And
Mhm.
so those are all things. Personality does matter
Yeah.
in getting, but so does the publication you're writing for, and your approach you take. And
Mhm.
obviously, if you have a record, if Murdoch sees that I profiled the year before his friend John Malone, and I didn't savage John Malone, I mean, that may have given him more confidence to talk to me.
Mhm. Kind of another controversial or criminal figure you've written about, Harvey Weinstein. You profiled him in 2002, and then 20 years later, 2022, you published one of your books on him. What was that process like? First interviewing him way back when, and then later coming back to kind of report not just on him as a figure, but him as like this criminal.
Harvey Weinstein, like Roy Cohn and a few other people I've profiled over the years, at first didn't want to cooperate in
Hmm.
2002. So I told his public relations advisor, I said, look, I'm just going to do this. I don't think it's in his interest for me to do a profile where he doesn't talk and I just
Hmm.
talk to people, including a heavy dose of critics. And Harvey then cooperated. In the course of, you're writing about a very big figure and a complicated figure, and who did some amazing movies. I mean, Shakespeare in Love. I mean, you can go on, Tarantino's movies, etc. And but I, but he was a bully. I mean, and I would witness how he abusive, verbally abusive to people he was, and then I would hear stories about him being physically abusive to women.
Hmm.
So I tried to nail that in 2002. And in my last interview with him, it was just the two of us in a conference room in his office. And I said, Harvey, tell me about the Venice Film Festival and what happened with Rowena Chu. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, did you attempt to rape Rowena Chu at the 1998 Venice Film Festival? And he stood up. Oh, I was seated. He stood up over me, facing me on the other side of the conference table, and said, if you write that, it will destroy my family, my three daughters, my wife. You can't write that. And he started clenching his fists, and his lip was trembling. And I thought he was going to take a poke at me. So I stood up opposite him. And I'm a kid from Coney Island, so I've had some experience as a boy with fisticuffs. And as I stood up, and then he did this amazing thing. He started to cry. And he loosened his fist and literally just started sobbing. And But I could not get Rowena Chu and the other woman who was involved with her to go on the record to talk about it. So I had Harvey saying it never happened, and I had an affair with her, and I left. I cheated on my wife, but I didn't, I didn't do anything with her. And she's just lying because she was bitter that I broke up with her. And Rowena would not talk to me, and the other woman I talked to, but she wouldn't confirm anything. They both signed non-disclosure agreements,
Hmm.
and so I didn't get the story. And it wasn't until Ronan Farrow then started reporting for MSNBC back in 2016 and asked me, came out to interview me, and I realized, God, he's got the story. He's got women on the record, which I failed to get in 2000.
Hmm.
And then he and the New York Times in the fall of 2017 broke the story about, with proof that Harvey Weinstein had abused, and 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 that helped create the Me Too movement, and ultimately sent Harvey Weinstein to jail.
Yeah. So how did kind of having this 2002 interview with him kind of affect the way that you went about your 2022 book?
Well, I tried to in the book which came out after Ronan Farrow's. I had helped Ronan Farrow and brought
Hmm.
him to the New Yorker, where his piece appeared, because I thought he really did an amazing job, and I thought the Times reporters did an amazing job. But what happened was that I said they have reported the awful things Harvey did. I want to write a biography of a guy to tell you about the awful things he did, but also about the amazing things he did in the movie industry. But I also then want to try and understand what motivated Harvey,
Mm.
what made him the monster he clearly was. And so I went back into his family life in Queens. And ultimately concluded that Harvey was a sociopath and had great access to his brother, who was his best friend, who ultimately broke with them, and to other people. And so it was a book, it was a biography. It wasn't just about his sexual harassment. It
Hmm.
included that, and included women talking to me about the awful things he did, but also talked about the people who knew what he was doing and were complicitous and were silent and didn't speak up and didn't try to stop him from the awful things he was doing. And also was a book about, you know, what drove Harvey Weinstein to be such a monster. And then I covered the trial, which was another interesting experience.
Hmm. Have you tried at all to follow up with Weinstein from behind bars?
Well, he and I had some email exchanges when he was in prison.
Hmm.
Um, and then ultimately we were supposed to have an interview, but he wanted me to give his lawyer my questions before, and I refused. And then we were supposed to have an interview. Still, he relented and said he would talk. And then his lawyer, he was on trial in Los Angeles, and his lawyer said, we can't speak, do anything that might jeopardize his trial in Los Angeles. So I have some email exchange, which I put in the book from him. But the long interview I wanted to do with him, to ask him about, some of the things I never got to do.
Something that just in researching you, I found so fascinating about your career is you've written so much about so many different topics. What does your thought process look like in deciding like what the next book is, what the next big story is, and how do you think that your different pieces of work have influenced one another?
Well, you're um, I've actually written 13 books,
Hmm.
and I think about it when I think my mind is racing over the titles now
Hmm.
and my first book was called The Streets Will Pay for Gold, which was about New York City. writing for I wrote a column for the New York Daily News then, and I was writing for New York Magazine and the Village Voice, and doing some TV stuff as well. But I was fascinated what happened in New York City, the fiscal crisis, why it happened. And I was always interested in the why questions, not just what happened, but why it happened. Same with Harvey, not just
Hmm.
what he did, but why he did what he did.
Hmm.
And then from then, I went on. I became interested, and why I don't remember. Why do some companies succeed, and what's a profile of a company I could do that may be one of the best in the world, and ask why are they one of the best in the world. And I wound up, you interview and talk to a lot of people, and I came up with a company called Schlumberger in the oil field business that was all over the world. Wildly successful company run by a man who considered himself a socialist, Jean Rabou, a Frenchman. And it was just a fascinating experience. So I wound up writing a two-part piece on this company. Why I decided at the time, I remember everyone was saying Japan is the future. This was in the early 80s.
Hmm.
And I wanted to see whether that were true. So I was playing off the news of the time. And obviously Schlumberger was not Japanese. But they created an interesting culture, I found. And then
Hmm.
from there, I became fascinated with the subject of poverty. Why? I don't know.
Hmm.
I was interested in is there a small, relatively small group of people who are responsible, disproportionately responsible for long-term welfare, for crime, drug use, etc. And that's why I wrote a three-part series for the New Yorker called The Underclass. Now, what drove me to write about poverty after writing about business or after writing about New York City's fiscal? Something triggered it. I don't to this day remember what it was. The other books, the later books, I can remember context. Three Blind Mice, I was interested in disruption, how the TV networks were being disrupted. After that, when I'm writing about Google, the end of the world as we know it, I was interested in how the digital world and the internet was disrupting all of media. Um, so the subject disruption became one I fancied and wanted to pursue and pursued regularly in my New Yorker piece. Um, so that connection, I have a much clearer sense in my mind of what provoked me to want to continue to dig and dig and dig into
Hmm.
the disruption question. The earlier, I don't remember, more episodic.
So I'm hearing like that it's equal that some stories have been about like the who of what you're covering versus the why of something that's going on. Which do you think is more relevant to your writing process? The subject you're writing about or the subject you're writing or the person you're profiling?
They're intertwined,
Hmm.
unavoidably intertwined. I mean, I can't do a who piece without doing a why piece.
Of course. So, kind of a few more questions from the audience. What do you want to ask Harvey Weinstein today? Or what would you ask Harvey Weinstein today?
Good question. Um,
That face implies you have a good answer.
any regrets? Do you any apologies you would make to Rowena Chu and Jessica Mann and these various women in your life? Um, what have we gotten wrong about you?
Hmm.
Um, those are some a few questions I would want to ask.
Those are real thought provokers. That especially for him probably. Kind of moving back into the field of politics, how do you think White House correspondents should cover Trump today?
Aggressively. I mean,
Yeah.
when I look at the New York Times, which I think is a model of covering Trump, I mean, I look
Hmm.
at Maggie Haberman, I look at some of the other reporters. I mean, they are writing about what he is doing and
Hmm.
and and the implications for what he's doing in a very profound way. Peter Baker, arguably the best White House correspondent. I remember when I did a piece in roughly it would have been 2009 or 10 on Obama and the press. And David Axelrod, who was Obama's chief political advisor, I asked him about White House correspondence. I said, who stands out? And he said to me, there's Peter Baker up here, everyone else is down here. And Peter Baker was once with the Washington Post, been with the Times a long time, written a number of very good books. But he just has context for everything he does. I mean, he knows history, um, and you read him, and he reeks of authority.
Mhm. Within kind of the pretext that the Trump administration is more than likely going to call whatever you report fake news regardless, do you think that has intimidated certain reporters from asking the more difficult questions?
Oh, I don't think undeniably so. I mean,
Mhm.
I think he's not only intimidated reporters, but their bosses,
Hmm.
the owners of. I mean, look, CBS, Viacom just paid $20 million to to Trump because Trump was insisting on it. And in order to get approval of their merger with the new company, they had to comply and kiss his rear end. And,
Hmm.
but CBS News did nothing wrong. There was no reason for them to pay that money except fear of Trump and fear of how we would use government to harm them. Same with ABC. I mean, Disney settled for $16 million because George Stephanopoulos basically had a one word. I mean, he said that Trump was found guilty of rape. He was found guilty of sexually harassing a woman. But the judge in the case, which is what George Stephanopoulos, I think, had in his mind, the judge in the case said you could equate what Trump did to this woman to rape. And somehow ABC, Disney, the parent company, agreed to pay $16 million to make it go away. Why? Because they're afraid that Trump's FCC or other government agency will harm them, and they're afraid of him. And look, the AP refused to. Trump says it's no longer the Gulf of Mexico; it's now the Gulf of America. And the AP insisted on continuing to call it the Gulf of Mexico. And what did Trump do? He said AP can't come into our meeting, into our Oval Office press briefings. Insane.
Hmm. So how would you cover him today, knowing that his mentor was your old pal Roy Cohn?
Well, I had interviewed him, as I said, back when
Mhm.
I did the Roy Cohn piece in 1978, and I had had some experiences with Trump in New York, and had written about him in my daily news column, not favorably, by the way.
Mhm.
Um, but Trump was a different guy then. Back then, he was very solicitous of the press. And I remember writing a very tough piece on him, how he got the Commodore Hotel, got a sweetheart deal to purchase the Commodore Hotel on East 42nd Street. And he called me up and he said, let's have lunch. And we never had lunch, I'm happy to say. But nevertheless, he was constantly trying to court you, and he doesn't do that anymore. I mean, he's always eager to talk to the press, but he's also eager to savage the press.
Mhm.
His enemies of the people, or fake news, et cetera, or evil people, lemmings. I mean, all phrases that he commonly uses. But I mean, how would you cover him? You, I think you just got to remember, he is not your audience. Your audience are your readers or your viewers, and you got to tell them the truth as you see it. You got to listen to them. You can't
Mhm.
dismiss someone. You can't blatantly call someone a fascist.
Mhm.
I mean, you quote someone if they call them a fascist, but your job is not to opine, but to tell the truth as best you see it without fear or favor.
Mhm.
It's
I think
tough. I mean, they are breathing down your neck, reporters. It's very tough on reporters in Trump's Washington.
mhm. Something I think is so interesting is that you talk about, your shareholders as a journalist being your readers. With Trump specifically, those readers are, proportionally going to be people who are part of his base. That base has been very active online. They've been very active with, kind of pursuing journalists who do not report on their president favorably. How do you kind of balance those two, like, truths that you do need to report to these people, but also these people are looking for a very specific version of the truth?
It's, but again, it's the truth as you see it, not as they.
Yeah.
You're the reporter. You're out there. They're not out there reporting.
Hmm.
And if Trump says something that contradicts what he said yesterday, if he says, I'm going to impose 2 weeks, I'm going to decide how to impose penalties on Putin, and the
Hmm.
2 weeks are now up, and he hasn't imposed those penalties. Your job as a reporter is to write that. Now,
Hmm.
that may not please some of his MAGA supporters, but I'm not a politician running for office. I'm not here to please them. I'm here
Hmm.
to tell the truth as best as I see it.
Hmm. And another one from the audience. Without revealing any names, are you working on any profiles today that would be another big shocking story?
Yes, and no, I'm not going to talk about it.
That's well, good luck. And kind of a quick one before we kind of like open the floor to more audience questions. As this like prolific media critic yourself, are there any up and coming media critics or journalists that you're a follower or a fan of?
Oh, I mean, I subscribe to a number of websites. I mean,
Hmm.
and journalism websites, including CNN and yeah, there's a galaxy of Dylan Byers, Buck. I mean, uh, what's his name at CNN? Um, God, I'm just names are racing out of my head. Brandon. Anyway, yes, there are a number of
Fantastic.
really good press critics out there who are aggressively doing their job and trying to hold people accountable, including the press, which needs to be held accountable.
Fantastic. Do you have any advice for young journalists trying to cut their teeth in the industry right now?
Yeah, don't um, don't just rely on your good writing or your good telegenic looks for television. You have to have multi talents. You have to know how to do a podcast or a remote on your cell phone, as well as write, as well as talk quickly and concisely.
Mhm.
It's a world that demands multi talents today,
Mhm.
not just a single talent.
Awesome. I think, and Adam, correct me if I'm wrong. I think this is the last question we have time for. Your book, Three Blind Mice: How the TV Networks Lost Their Way, was hailed by Frank Stanton, president of CBS from 1946 to 1973, as the best book ever written on network television. Do you believe that networks have found their way since?
No, I think networks are challenged. I mean, I mentioned a figure earlier that back in the early 80s, 90% of people watching television watched just three networks.
Hmm.
Today, there are four networks counting Fox, and only 10% of Americans are watching them. They're watching Netflix and Apple and etc. Or they're on their cell phone, or they're on YouTube um, or or Facebook. So I think inevitably democracy, the internet, and cable and satellite have democratized information, and people get it from many different places.
Hmm.
And they people in younger people are getting many of them are getting the news from TikTok and Facebook, not from me or you or newspapers or television today. And that's life. Now the question is that accurate information that they're getting? or is it information that just reinforces their views because they can actually go to, with likes, they can go to what they like to receive or what
Hmm.
they like to receive. And that's one of the big dangers today in the world of media and to a democracy is no more universal facts. People get
Hmm.
to choose their own facts. And if you watch Fox News, you get a different set of facts than if you watch CNN or you read the New York Times. And in a democracy, how do you compromise and get together with people when their reality is very different than your reality? And,
Hmm.
and so it becomes a real divide and a real chasm in a democracy. And if you get rabid views, it undermines the trust you need for democracy to work. You have to assume that the person on the other side of the aisle of another party is not a traitor, is not a
Hmm.
lemming, is not an enemy of the people. And if you think they are, how are you going to compromise with them, which is
Hmm.
essential in democracy? So there are real information challenges ahead with the bifurcation of the media as it is today.
Fantastic. So, actual last question this time. Is there anyone who has passed away that you wish you could have interviewed while they were alive? Or interview now, post mortem?
I'd love to interview Bobby Kennedy about his son, Bobby Kennedy. Um,
Sure, that
I,
would be a conversation.
that'd be some conversation.
What do you think he would say?
Well, the father would not scold his son. Uh,
Mm,
I think that's given, and the sense of loyalty, but it would cause him enormous pain. And just look at how the cousins in that family and the brothers
mm,
and sisters, many of them were turned against Robert Kennedy Jr. for
mm.
the positions he's taken. Um, but I mean, that would be a very human conversation potentially, but I don't think he would open up. So essentially, I have to rethink that and say I probably would not pursue that interview because I know it wouldn't lead anywhere.
Be a personal conversation, not a professional
Right.
conversation.
Yeah, I mean, he would say to me, "Can we talk off the record?" And I would say, "What value is that to for me as a journalist? As a human being, I understand it, but as a journalist, it's useless. I couldn't write about it."
Well, thank you, Ken, so much for your time. I believe that's all the time we have. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for making time. Are there any pluggables you have that you're working on right now that you want to mention before we wrap up?
I'm cool. I'm cool.
Awesome,
Thank you.
fantastic.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.